Welcome to Charter California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. Our guest today is Mike Ramos. He is the District Attorney for San Bernardino County. After we speak with Mr. Ramos, we'll be speaking with Paul Zellerbach. He's the District Attorney for Riverside County. So thank you so much for joining us, D.A. Ramos. We appreciate it. I want to speak with you about one of the ugliest things in humanity, and that is human trafficking.
Yes.
There is some good news, arguably, that Prop 35 passed by a huge margin. Huge margin. Some say there's a realignment issue and maybe we shouldn't be increasing penalties, but be that as it may, talk to us about Prop 35.
Well, Prop 35 I was supporting. Huge initiative. It broke the records. Over 80% of the voters voted for it. And you're right, with our legislature, we can't pass anything that's going to make things tougher on our criminals.
Right.
So in this situation, it's really going to help my office, Paul Zellerbach's office, and the DAs across the state to really increase the punishment for these people that are trafficking our citizens, especially the young girls in the area of sex trafficking.
Yeah, and please let's talk about that, because when we think about human trafficking, we are talking about girls who don't even have teen in their age. I mean, we're talking about 12-year-olds sometimes.
12-year-olds. We've seen a case where an 11-year-old, but yes, the average, they start them at 12 and 13 years old, and this is when they grab these girls and they turn them and they sexually abuse them first, and then they put them on the streets and start trafficking them, especially in the sex trade. Not even talking about the labor issue, but the sex trade, where we're really now going to hammer these pimps and human traffickers.
And let's talk about that, because there are three prongs to the attack, as you know.
Right.
We're looking at the pimps.
Sure.
We're looking at the Johns.
Sure.
And we're looking at the victims.
Right. It's a whole way in the way we do things. Suppression, the first prong. We're going to go after the pimps. The pimps.
That's the pimp.
Oh, yeah, and we're doing a job. We just sentenced one to 30 to life for doing this. He was a three-striker. He's a gang member. Okay. Then you have the young, we used to file as prostitutes and consider them defendants. We are now treating them as victims. They're victimized. They're being trafficked.
Let's talk about that, because that is the most troubling. Is what do you do with a 15-year-old girl, or 19-year-old girl for that matter? I mean, minor, majority or minority, when they're committing illegal acts, but you can see this is not their choice.
Oh, they're victims. And we created the Coalition Against Sexual Exploitation of Minors case in my county. Started in 2009 with the help of our Attorney General, now Kamala Harris. And we put all the departments from the county together: Department of Mental Health, Social Services, Education, our Public Defender's Office, our office, the courts, nonprofit, faith-based.
Right.
And we have a program for them now, and we just opened our first home, Rachel's House, where these girls have a place to go.
Right.
It's just an awesome way that we're going to help these girls, because before they'd be released from juvenile hall and the pimp would be waiting at the door to pick them up, literally. And put them back on the streets.
When I think about the Inland Empire, one of the benefits, arguably, is that there is a thriving Indian gaming industry.
Yes.
And that brings jobs, and I cast no aspersions on that.
Right.
But with gaming can come some of what we've discussed.
Sure.
So I believe most of the casinos are in Riverside County.
Right.
But that being said, it's still the region.
It is a region. You got to look at it. But we are blessed with San Manuel Indian Tribe in my county, because yes, they are really pro-support law enforcement in my office, and they run a very clean place. The scary thing is gangs are now getting involved in this area. They are now recruiting these girls and using them as part of their criminal economy. And that's what we really need to start taking a look at.
What can we do if we're driving on the streets and we see a young girl that appears to be a prostitute and likely not wanting to be where she is?
Right. You can first call your local police agency. Report it immediately. Then you can contact on our website CASE. There's a phone number.
Right. If you live in San Bernardino County,
and you can help that girl through that system as well.
What about getting involved in Rachel's House? Are there volunteer opportunities?
There's volunteer opportunities for Rachel's House. There's ways that you can, they're looking for donations for clothes for these girls and
Where
those
is Rachel's
kinds of
House?
things.
Do you know?
It's right in downtown San Bernardino. I believe it's on
Fair enough. Downtown San Bernardino.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
If it's okay, I want to talk about three strikes. Is that okay
with
you? Yeah.
Please.
So three strikes is such an interesting issue when think about California.
Right.
Because California voters were quite supportive of 3 strikes when it passed in the 90s.
Right.
A couple of years back, there was an attempt to reform 3 strikes. It looked like it was going to pass. Talk radio got a hold of it. It failed.
Right.
In 2012, 3 strikes reform went up on the ballot, and it passed almost as much as Prop 35.
Right.
I mean, it was close to 70%.
Right.
That is a huge shift.
It is a
from
shift.
just a few years back. I think it was on the 2006 ballot when it failed. What has happened in 6 years to cause such a dramatic shift in California's population that we're willing to look at that 3rd strike and say, if it's not serious or violent, maybe the 3rd strike shouldn't result in 25 to life?
There are 2 factors. One is I think the public's seeing what the governor and everybody said with AB 109, the prisons
Which is
are
realignment.
packed, realignment. We better do something with these 3 strike people. But that's a fallacy. They're only 4% of our prison population.
What, these non-violent 3rd strikers?
Secondly, all of our energies, myself included, in the district attorneys of California, went into the proposition against the death penalty. We didn't fight it this time like we did before. So politically, they kind of
So you were not supportive of 3 strikes reform?
No. I think we use our discretion. I know we do in San Bernardino
But
County.
that's interesting because, LA County uses discretion.
Absolutely.
You say that San Bernardino
We do.
County, and I believe you.
Right.
But, I look at, for example, Riverside County under the prior administration.
Right.
I believe the DA was Rod Pacheco. He, as I understand it, did not use his discretion.
And under my prior administration,
Okay.
we had to go all the way to the top to plead a case out. So maybe there are some cases. We're going to take a look at them. We have a system now. Since the people said we're going to pass this, I'm willing to do it as the DA, and we're going to do what's right.
Right. Let's talk about the death penalty.
Please.
Which also a very interesting debate as we were looking at the issues in November of 2012. California in a lot of ways is schizophrenic when it comes to crime and justice issues.
Right.
At the same time that they're passing 3 strikes reform by very large margins, they voted against death penalty reform, which would have eliminated the death penalty.
Huge.
As they're voting for President Obama, with 60% of the vote.
It was a battle. I was nervous. And the entire nation was watching our state.
Why? And I'm not taking a personal position, but I really want to talk it through and understand why you are such a strong supporter of the death penalty. What is, in the wake of the fact that very few people are executed on death row, most die of natural causes, it's incredibly expensive to prosecute, it's incredibly expensive to incarcerate, and arguably, it's more punishing to leave them in jail to rot than to put them to death.
Okay. I'll get that last argument.
How'd you like that?
No, the first argument, and here's my passion, is victims of crime. And when you have little babies that are tortured, you have multiple victims, you have 143 of those people on death row that have killed a police officer in the line of duty that's protecting us, the most horrific criminals. We don't seek death on all the death penalty cases we could. It's a small majority of the murders. I mean, you're talking 724 people on death row. So we take the matter very serious. And then the continued suffering of these families. I mean, during this time of year, the holidays.
Does death necessarily make it better?
Nothing makes it better. But the proper punishment, if you're going to take somebody's life in this horrendous way, you should have to give your life. And I will tell you, and I see the other side of the argument, but I'm going to tell you something. LWOP in prison?
LWOP means
life without parole. That's a country club. You're watching color TV.
Why?
You're visiting
isn't that
families.
The issue? But maybe that's the issue. Why is LWOP, as you call it, a country club? It should not be a country club.
It shouldn't be.
And why is it we have to wait 20 years to execute someone if they've had that sentence?
We need to fix it.
So when? How?
There's a problem now.
How?
Now that we want it. I said, if we don't fix this now, they're going to come back with another initiative. And we're going to be fighting this again, and it'll pass.
Mm-hmm.
So now we got to fix the appellate process. We beat the ACLU and their $7 million.
But which
now we got to
appellate
fix
process? Is it the federal appellate process?
Both.
But we can't fix. I mean, you're California.
Where California will fix California's. You only get so many times to the California appellate process. Then you get the feds, and that's something that we need to work as the National District Attorneys Association to change those laws at the federal level.
Because that's the issue, is the appellate process, and because you can seek habeas corpus in federal court.
Absolutely.
It can be very
it's a
troubling.
delay tactic for the defense attorney. That's what
His name is Mike Ramos. He is the district attorney for San Bernardino County. When we come back, we'll speak with his colleague, Paul Zellerbach. He is the district attorney for Riverside County. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are now joined by the DA from Riverside County. His name is Paul Zellerbach. Mike Ramos sends his best.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you've worked with him in the past, being sister counties, of course.
On many things.
Yes, I wanted to speak with you about a very troubling trend, and that is the use of drugs by high school students. And not just the use, but the sale. And that's what we're seeing more of.
Unfortunately, we are, and it's the transactional stuff, the sales on the high school campus that troubles me, if not just as much as the use, but even more so.
And so I want to use just one high school as an example. I'm not picking on this high school. It happens in a lot of different places. But recently, there were 22 student arrests at Temecula Valley High School. Oh, there were a few, actually. Was it just at Temecula Valley?
There were 3 different high schools in the Temecula area.
Temecula Valley High School, Chaparral High, and Rancho Vista Continuation.
Correct.
22 arrests.
Correct.
What happened?
This was a situation where 2 undercover officers enrolled in school back in August of this year as students. And
how old were they really?
They were in their early 20s, but they looked very youthful. They passed as students.
Clearly.
And were in the classes for over approximately 6 months.
I would love to do that just to do that.
And got involved in the drug culture on those campuses.
But that's the troubling part. I don't mean to make light, but that's the troubling part.
That is a troubling part. And the best way to send the message to these students is to do undercover operations like this, because then the students are wary that could happen anywhere on any campus.
But here's what's so surprising. I would have expected that they could find marijuana being used. Maybe cocaine, maybe. The list of drugs was just devastating. Marijuana, cocaine, meth, ecstasy, heroin.
LSD.
LSD.
Yes.
This is not simple, simple drugs. These are, pathway drugs. They were on their way.
We're beyond pathway drugs. And also what we found was prescription medications, hydrocodone.
Oxycontin.
Oxycontin is also very popular on high school campuses as well.
Are they getting them from their parents' drug cabinets?
To a certain extent, yes.
So when you saw this list of drugs, including heroin, LSD, meth, what do you do at that point? Because obviously you're dealing with children, teenagers. What do you do next?
Well, it obviously depends upon a lot of factors, and you want to look at each case and each situation individually. But nonetheless, from what I understand in talking to the law enforcement officers involved in this operation, these kids were very cavalier and very open about how much drugs they could sell, and there was no limit.
That is stunning, especially when you think about Temecula. It's not on the coast. It's not near a border. Where are they getting all these drugs?
Well, that's what ultimately we hope to continue our investigation in. But again, this kind of operation occurred in 2011 as well at different high schools, one in Moreno Valley and one in Lake Elsinore.
Right.
So it can happen on any high school campus anywhere.
So obviously these individuals will go through the juvenile justice system. Some actually were 18, so they go through the adult justice system.
Correct. 2 of the 22 were adults.
So what happens as they go through the system? Is the effort to lock them up, throw away the key? Is the effort to rehabilitate? What happens?
The whole dynamic in juvenile court is rehabilitation, different than on the adult side, which is more punitive in nature.
But the 18-year-olds, they just...
Well, they're going to be prosecuted as adults, but at the same time, drug sales are drug sales.
I understand.
And especially when they're on the high school campus.
So the sales were on campus?
Actually, most of them were either on campus or right off campus. Okay. And most of these individuals who are being prosecuted made multiple sales to the undercover officers. So it wasn't a one-time deal.
Right. These were not the kids that bought, a quick dime bag and...
No.
This is a whole different ball of wax.
And they were willing to do much larger quantities if the undercover officers wanted it.
Do you work with the school districts?
We do, in the sense that they know that the undercover officers are there in the classes to a very limited sense. We try and keep that information as closely contained as possible.
You have to. And ultimately, these students, under zero tolerance policies, will be expelled. I know is that not your area?
That's not.
So you have no involvement?
That's up to the individual schools and their districts.
So this begs the question, what should we do as parents? What should we do as educators? What should we do as a community?
Well, like many things in life, it all starts at home.
Right.
We executed some search warrants at these kids' homes where they lived with their parents. And on many occasions, we found drugs and indicia of drug sales in the homes. And so maybe the parents can be a little more vigilant of their children.
Were any parents involved?
Not to my knowledge.
So what can law enforcement do in terms of working with parents? Because look, it's amazing how teenagers can pull the wool over the eyes of their parents. They just may not know what's happening. And I would hope that through this process, it's not just about rehabilitation or punishment, it's also about preventing it from happening again. You know, giving parents the tools, educators the tools to prevent this.
I think it has to be almost a community effort. I think we need more involvement from the parent side, and we need to coordinate that with the school districts, the DA's office, probation department, maybe even public health agencies, to, as a team, focus in on our high school campuses and address these issues.
And what about the courts? You were a judge, and that's why I'm asking you. You know, what do the courts do at that stage? Were you ever a juvenile judge?
I was not. I was a juvenile court prosecutor for many years.
Oh,
but
so then I ask you yet again. I mean,
again, the focus in juvenile court is more towards rehabilitation than adult court, but the court is very limited, you know,
really?
in what it can do. It sentences the juvenile or the adult to certain terms and conditions, but then it's out of the court's hands thereafter. And there needs to be follow-up. Once these cases are adjudicated through the court system, what's important is to have follow-up with the probation department or youth services or intervention and counseling.
Does that happen?
It does happen, and I'm certainly hopeful that it will happen in these kids' situations.
If I may, I want to shift gears and ask you about a proposition that was on the ballot in November, and that dealt with the death penalty. As you know, California does seem to be a bit schizophrenic on its crime and justice positions. It passes 3 strikes reform, yet it upholds the death penalty, which is fine. I mean, you know, I'm not taking a position. It's not surprising by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think there's a sense that unless there is death penalty reform over the next few years, another proposition will come on the ballot, and it would likely pass. And we would not see the death penalty in this state. You're a proponent of the death penalty, as is Mike Ramos. I spoke with him earlier. Is the criminal justice community coming together to try to figure out what can be done to improve the justice of the death penalty?
I think there are several things that can be improved upon, and several DAs met with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court a couple weeks ago to talk about some things that the court can institute regarding rules of court to expedite the process and speed it up. There's funding issues for defense attorneys to speed up the process. Part of the problem right now, for just a good example, is the fact that a person on death row, once they're convicted and sentenced to death, they don't get an appellate attorney assigned to them until approximately 5 years after they were sentenced.
That's crazy.
So it's just, no pun intended, it's dead time. They're just
literally
sitting there, and their appeal is going nowhere because they don't have an appellate attorney appointed to them.
What's the delay?
Money.
Money.
And attorneys willing to take on death penalty cases.
The other issue, and I asked DA Ramos this, is that you may be able to reform the California appellate side, but then the defendants can go to the federal side, and there's no, I mean, you're a county DA in the state of California. You're not a U.S. attorney, you know, for the federal government.
Correct. And I think the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which California is in, is well known for its liberal views. But again, we need to work on the state side first and
get that
house in order, then we can move on to the federal side.
Okay, Paul Zellerbach, we thank you for joining us. He is the DA of Riverside County. When we come back, we'll be speaking with one of Paul's, we'll call him subordinates. His name is Gerald Fineman. He is a supervising district attorney in the office, and he's an expert in the crime of strangulation. You'll want to hear that. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. I'm glad you're still with us. Our guest is Gerald Fineman. He is a supervising deputy at the Riverside County District Attorney's Office. And sir, you have brought to our attention an issue that is devastating but so important to understand. And that is the question of strangulation and how the law in California had not treated strangulation with the severity it needed to. Let's talk about that, if we may.
Sure. Until January of 2012, California did not recognize strangulation as a separate crime. California now is the 35th state to recognize strangulation as a separate crime and to understand that strangulation is a particularly dangerous type of infliction of injury, even in cases where it might not leave behind a visible mark.
And you brought us a video which is quite instructive. I'd like to play it now, and I'd like you to give us a sense of what is happening during a strangulation and why it can be so incredibly destructive to human life when one may not even realize it. I mean, it can really cause serious harm or death quickly.
Very quickly. In as little as 5 seconds, you can lose consciousness as a result of being strangled. And
5 seconds?
5 seconds you can lose consciousness.
Okay, so explain the process.
Sure. As we sit and talk right here, right now, we're breathing in air, and as we breathe air through our lungs, that air becomes oxygenated and oxygenates our blood. And the oxygenated blood travels through our body, and we call that oxygenated blood that's traveling through our body, oxygenated blood going through our arteries. So if you've heard of the carotid artery, which usually comes up, we talk about law enforcement exercising a control type hold on suspects. They're cutting off the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain. Coming out of the brain, we also have the jugular vein, which comes down through your neck, and that takes the deoxygenated blood out of your neck.
And so when someone grabs a hold of another individual, what is actually happening?
Well, what's actually happening is you're cutting off either the flow of blood or the flow of air, and that cutting off the flow of blood or air is what we would call strangulation. When you cut off that flow of blood, if you stop oxygenated blood from getting to your brain is starved of oxygen, and it takes as little as 10 pounds of pressure.
10 pounds, that's nothing.
10 pounds is about what it takes to open a soda can. So when you think about that kind of force that it takes to pop the top on a soda can, that's what you're looking at.
Before we talk about the domestic violence aspect of this, we know that strangulation has been used as a form of entertainment. I mean, I'll forget the autoerotic side because that tends to be a solitary act. I'm talking about kids, college students thinking this is fun.
Yes, there's actually videos on the internet where college students and high school students are playing what they call the choking game or pass out, where they will actually strangle themselves or strangle a friend to the point that they lose consciousness. They explain it as having a feeling of lightheadedness or almost euphoria, and really what they're experiencing is their brain starving of oxygen. They're killing off brain cells that will never regenerate.
Literally.
Literally.
So let's discuss the domestic violence side, because that obviously is what's most troubling. And I don't want to pretend that domestic violence cannot be meted out by a woman to a man, but we know as it relates to strangulation, this is really a one-way street, that it's men that are abusing women via strangulation.
Yes, and we've seen through a study that was conducted down in San Diego and published in the Journal of Emergency Medical Medicine that out of a course of 300 individuals, almost every one of them was a male perpetrator of strangulation violence.
It's 299 out of 300.
Yes.
I mean, it's that severe. And when you think about, again, maybe it's a stereotype, but men tend to be stronger than women. I mean, it's just the way we're built and born. I mean, it can cause damage quickly. And
yes, well, domestic violence is a control type of crime, and this is an ultimate form of control. If you think about inflicting violence on someone with a gun, you can inflict that violence from a distance. This is very intimate. I mean, the batter is actually holding on to their victim and looking into the eyes of their victim as they take the life right from them.
So describe to us the new law. You mentioned it briefly, but I want to understand what the law was and what it is today, because it really is an example of, sometimes Sacramento gets it right. And here's an example of Sacramento getting it right.
Yes, the law now recognizes that you can inflict domestic violence on another individual by means of strangulation. We took California's existing domestic violence law, Penal Code Section 273.5, and inserted into that specific language that recognizes that injury on a victim can be inflicted by means of strangulation.
Because before, there was only, I guess, an enhancement for strangulation if there was death?
Well, really before, there was no separate crime in California that recognized strangulation.
So what would you do if there was evidence of strangulation? What would you, for what section would you use?
You could charge it as perhaps an assault with force likely to cause great bodily injury, and you would have to explain to a jury how this strangulation, which in the medical study done in San Diego left no visible injuries in 50% of the incidents, how that was somehow going to cause death or great bodily injury. And it was very difficult for juries to understand. It was also very difficult for law enforcement to understand. Now it's included in our law so that we know that it is a part of domestic violence.
So what can be done now to get out the word about the new law, but more importantly, trying to prevent this act of violence? Because in the end, we don't want to charge anyone for it. We want people to understand that strangulation, even for but 5 seconds, can cause injury or death.
Yes. If you've been a victim of strangulation or you know someone that's been a victim of strangulation, you need to get them medical attention immediately. That was the number one thing that came out of the San Diego study, was the importance of medical attention. Even though you may not manifest any sort of external injury, there may be internal injury that you can't see. And they actually had 2 victims in San Diego who died as a result of having swelling in their airway, and the airway closed up so that these victims could no longer breathe, and they died as a result of that.
So in the year that you've been operating under this law, and we'll just use Riverside County as a laboratory, have you used this new law?
We have, and we've had prosecutors actually prosecute a couple cases under this new law successfully at jury trial, and be able to show juries through the use of expert testimony that this is a very dangerous form of injury.
And you're past verdict, right?
Yes.
So could you tell us one case in our final couple of minutes?
Sure. We had a victim that, when law enforcement responded, had a very minor red mark on her neck, and the victim described being strangled. What she said was she was choked, and that's a very common misnomer. Choking is when your airway is obstructed from food or other kind of obstruction. This is external pressure being applied. The officers were trained in how to investigate strangulation cases. They took the investigation. At trial, the victim changed her testimony and said she didn't recall whether she was strangled or not. We were able to bring in an expert witness.
Was it her boyfriend or husband?
It was, I believe, her husband. We were able to bring in an expert witness who could describe their training and experience in this field and tell the jury why this was dangerous, and explain just how little force was necessary and what actually is occurring internally before you even see those red marks.
So what happened?
The jury came back in less than an hour and convicted the defendant.
And what's the ultimate sentence in this type of case?
Well,
I guess it depends on priors, but as a general proposition.
The ultimate sentence can be anywhere from being placed on probation all the way up to state prison commitment. This particular defendant did not have any other prior history, and the judge gave the defendant a substantial period of custody, but did not sentence him to state prison. The defendant was also required to receive counseling in terms of batter's treatment, and to...
and what about the victim?
The victim receives counseling through Victims of Crime, and also through the District Attorney's Office Victim Witness Program. Our Victim Witness Program contacts every victim of domestic violence event, whether they are actively seeking assistance or not, and we make that assistance available to them.
His name is Gerald Fineman. I appreciate everything you're doing to keep the people of California safe. He is the Supervising Deputy of Riverside County's District Attorney's Office. I'm Brad Pomerance. We thank you so much for watching Charter California Edition.